The 20th anniversary of Tiananmen Square happened about a year and a half ago. You don't exactly celebrate an anniversary like that, but it was widely commemorated, I guess, all over the West, all over American media, all over European media, pretty much everywhere. Where it was not covered so much was where Tiananmen Square is, where that happened. What the Chinese people, especially young Chinese people, think and know about that massacre in 1989 is actually quite different from what we think and know about it. When Americans think about Tiananmen Square, we mostly think of this image, right? A lone Chinese protester facing off against a column of military tanks. This is the iconic image of the heroism and bravery showed by those protesters before they were massacred by their own government in Tiananmen Square. But if you were born in China in the last 20 years, this image probably means nothing to you. Check this out. This is from an interview that the PBS show Frontline did with young Chinese students fairly recently.
Show this picture around and tell me what that picture says to you. Pass them around.
They were baffled.
I really can't tell anything from this picture. There's no context.
Is this a piece of artwork? Did you make this up?
Chinese students completely confused by what we think of as an iconic and universal image. There are, of course, dissidents in China today who continue to try to keep the truth alive about what actually happened in Tiananmen Square. But the government there has really effectively maintained a 20-year-long lie about Tiananmen. 20-year-long lie that Tiananmen was no big deal. There certainly wasn't anything heroic about it, except maybe on the government side. From the government's perspective, they say they were criminals and thugs causing chaos, an anti-Chinese uprising. The government just had to restore order. That's all. They had to. One Chinese college student interviewed about this by The New Yorker recently said this, quote, the Chinese government had to use any way it could to put down that event. You know, in the uprising in Iran a couple of years ago, after the bogus presidential election there in 2009, we saw that government take pretty much the same line in terms of propaganda, in terms of labeling the opposition movement as dangerous thugs from whom the government had to protect the country.
The message the government wants to convey is clear. The demonstrators are foreign-inspired rioters, looters, and terrorists.
Demonstrators are rioters, looters, and terrorists. In Iran, the government didn't just describe the protests as violent. In Iran, they sent government forces out into the streets in plain clothes to make their own propaganda come true, to in fact make the streets turn violent.
With clubs, tear gas, and axes, witnesses say Iran today crushed demonstrators who dared to take to the streets. The militia, often in plain clothing and loyal to Iran's supreme leader, has used crude weapons, including sticks, axes, chains, and machetes. In Baharistan Square today, demonstrators say the militia attacked.
In order to cement the idea that the protests in Iran were criminal, that the population needed the state to come in and establish order against these criminal mobs, the Iranian government went one step further.
They are among the most chilling images out of Iran. Public confessions, allegedly from demonstrators, broadcast today on Iranian state television.
We set public property on fire. We threw stones. We attacked people's cars and broke windows.
We misused the crowds and riots and started to steal.
Videotaped confessions from protesters saying, we're criminals, we're criminals. You know, there's a very slim playbook for how you survive a revolution when all or almost all of the people in your country are against you. It is a very slim playbook, but it sometimes works. And this is the main play in that playbook. This is option A for what authoritarian regimes do to try to hang on to power when their people turn against them. It's the I'll protect you from the criminal mob strategy. You need the firm hand of government to restore order against these protests, because these protests aren't just protests, they're lawless thugs. That strategy is at work right now in Egypt. But right from the outset, in this case, it has seemed clear that it will not work this time. While Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak was speaking last night, calling the protesters looters, arsonists, he said, those who intimidated unsuspecting citizens of Egypt. While Mubarak was railing against these supposed angry mobs who were actually the protesters against him, all of the press reports coming from press who were out actually covering those protests were describing protest scenes instead as jubilant, as joyful, as having a carnival-like atmosphere. So when President Mubarak said the protests were violent mobs, was he describing reality? No, he wasn't. But he was telegraphing very clearly his strategy, what he was about to do, what was about to happen. We were even able to report last night. The last thing in our reporting on Egypt last night was essentially, here it comes. We were already getting reports at that point that President Mubarak's people would be out in the streets today looking for blood, looking to make the propaganda come true, looking to make the protests seem violent. That's what we reported last night as what to look out for today. And we weren't able to say it in advance because we're geniuses. It's because the Egyptian government was telegraphing that they were going to do it. And then sure enough today, as planned, as telegraphed, totally transparently, they started the violence.
For hours, they fought running battles in the streets. What began as an exchange of chants and insults quickly became much worse. At one point, pro-Mubarak supporters on horses and camels ploughed through the crowd using whips and sticks. While some answered the call to prayer, the cameras picked up where crowds found opponents separated from their group. Soon, they were swallowed up in a sea of anger and hate. The army had initially kept both sides apart, but then allowed pro-Mubarak supporters into the square. The violence erupted soon after. While the fighting continued, there has been no hint of army intervention.
Pro-Mubarak forces took to the streets of Cairo today. As you saw, some riding camels and horses, wielding sticks, machetes, whips, attacking the anti-government protests. According to the latest reports available, 3 Egyptians were killed in the chaos today. Over 600 were wounded. Protesters on the ground, as well as reporters, described the pro-Mubarak forces today as plainclothes police officers, some of whom were being paid by the government to create violence, to disrupt the protests. Anti-Mubarak protesters held up for the cameras what they said were police ID cards that they say they pulled off these pro-Mubarak forces. Again, the official story here is that protests just organically became violent today because anti-government protesters are bad people. They're looters and thugs. That is the official story. That is the way that President Mubarak is apparently trying to stay in office. But the difference between here and Iran is that really nobody believes it. And why does nobody believe it? Because the official story here has competition. Because the perspective of the people on the ground who can actually see what's happening, it has a way of getting out. Because there is something other than state-controlled media able to operate in Egypt and actually say what is going on. The official story here is very important to Mubarak's strategy to stay in power and defeat the revolution. And the official story in Egypt this year, in this revolution, it has competition.
President Mubarak decided to stage a crackdown not in the form of sending police in or sending soldiers in, but by sending thugs in.
We've spoken to the demonstrators. They say that a lot of these people are paid thugs, enforcers for President Mubarak's political party. They say a lot of them are also plainclothes policemen.
Our sister network Sky News is reporting lynchings have been widespread. Lynchings. We're told there is evidence that the government has been paying Mubarak supporters to go on the attack.
There are people who believe that among the protesters on the pro-Mubarak side, there might be some people who are actually members of the police.
A member of parliament went on Al Jazeera today and admitted business associates close to the regime did in fact pay some of these pro-Mubarak protesters to hit the streets. Does that surprise you?
No. The purpose of this may have been to intimidate the people in the streets, may have been to create a real sense of crisis, to force the army's hand.
The only way President Mubarak survives this revolution is if people do not believe the kinds of reports you just heard, or if the people in Egypt do not have a way to hear it. Mubarak's official story is that the protesters against him turned violent today. The official story is evident bullpucky, and it cannot survive real reporting and the protesters being able to speak for themselves. The official story cannot survive the competition of the real story. And so now, as predictably as all the rest of it, the Mubarak regime is apparently attacking the competition for their official story. They're attacking journalists. It is not an accident that so many journalists were caught up in violence today. They are singling journalists out.
We've also noticed a very distinct change in the mood here, because there was a feeling that we could go out safely in previous days, but today there have been a number of attacks on foreign and British journalists.
Journalists across Egypt today became the subject of attacks from pro-Mubarak forces. A journalist with Gulf News in Dubai reporting today, quote, protesters are hunting down Al Jazeera journos. I keep having to clarify that I'm not one of them. One reporter from Al Arabiya TV went missing for part of the day today and was later found severely beaten and taken to the hospital. American journalists like two AP correspondents, our own Richard Engel and Anderson Cooper of CNN, also found themselves under attack today from pro-government protesters, kicked and punched and otherwise obstructed as they attempted to do their jobs.
The goon squads also appeared to have orders to hunt journalists. They chased us down.
The clashes have started to spread outside of Tahrir Square. There was also a lot of angry people who are angry with journalists.
When our crew went out to film beauty shots early this morning with no idea that the situation was now different, they were confronted by soldiers and plainclothes agents. They were armed, they were intimidated and bullied, and in fact marched at gunpoint through the streets all the way back to our hotel.
I talked to some British journalists who were held for 4 hours today, hooded, tied, and questioned, interrogated because someone saw them with a camera.
Hooded. Today, the Committee to Protect Journalists described the turn of events as the Egyptian government, quote, employing a strategy of eliminating witnesses to their actions. This is not journalists being caught in the crossfire. This is journalists being specifically targeted. Why? Because their ability to put out an alternate version to the plainly absurd official story is probably the difference between President Mubarak surviving this revolution or not surviving it. We are all concerned for our colleagues who are there covering the events in Egypt, but this is also one of those times when it is clear how important it is that they are there. Richard Engel joins us live from Cairo next.